Hello and welcome to the Sciences of the Origin project. We are glad to have you join us as we delve into the philosophical and methodological foundations of the scientific quest for the origins of the universe, life and mind through interdisciplinary perspectives. The main aim of this project is to discuss common methodological challenges of cosmology, biology and archaeology, three fields that stare into the past and try to find evidence of origins. New Sciences of the Origin interviews are supported by the University of Oxford project New Horizons for Science and Religion in Central and Eastern Europe, funded by John Templeton Foundation. My name is Monika Milosavljević and I am an assistant professor of archaeology at the University of Belgrade. My guest today is well-known archaeologist and philosopher Alison Wylie. Alison is Professor of Philosophy of Social and Historical Sciences at the University of British Columbia and Canada Research Chair in Philosophy of the Social and Historical Sciences. Professor Wylie is the author of Thinking from Things with Robert Chapman. She is also the co-author of Evidential Reasoning, as well as co-editor of Material Evidence Learning from Archaeological Practice. The major themes her work explores are evidential reasoning in archaeology, situated knowledge and objectivity, as well as research ethics that emphasize collaborative work with descendant communities. Why is philosophy indivisible from archaeological digging? Why is practice unable to be separated from philosophy?
I was so intrigued that you raised that question, because I remember when I was asked to write a preface for Thinking from Things, the editor for the series that book is in said, well, people always ask how you come to do philosophy and archaeology together. You really need to explain that at the beginning of the book. So I found myself thinking about just this issue. And what struck me at the time, and I think I would still endorse this view, is that philosophical issues are just woven through archaeological practice. They emerge in the practice. Partly because archaeology is so hard, conceptually and in other ways. You're necessarily, as you work, as you're in the field or as you're designing projects, and certainly when you're trying to make sense of whatever data you've gathered, there are lots of philosophical issues familiar in philosophy of science, for example, about how you interpret, how you recognize and interpret data to start with, how you constitute evidence, what counts as credible evidence, what counts as compelling argument from evidence for or against a set of reconstructions or claims. So I see philosophy and archaeology as indivisible, not uniquely indivisible. I think one could say this about other fields as well. But in the case of archaeology, because the empirical evidence is often complex to work with, philosophical issues of the kind I've just described are always close to the surface. One other thing I would say, there's a philosopher of science, of the historical sciences, Adrian Curry. He's currently at Exeter. And he's been intent on showing why, when people moan about how, the historical sciences are, uniquely challenged, they're epistemically unlucky. And he argues that, well, not more unlucky than other fields, maybe different in strategy. And that was part of my motivation. But to the extent that historical scientists and archaeologists face particular challenges, I think the philosophical issues that other researchers can set aside are always in the mix and often prominent.
Do you think there may be a credible epistemological resolution in contemporary archaeology of the hyper-relativism of post-processual archaeology and the return of biology based on omnipresence of DNA and isotope analysis? What would be the middle ground between these two?
Yeah, that is exactly articulating what that middle ground looks like and how it works. That was the motivation for a lot of my own work, but for writing together with Bob Chapman, Evidential Reasoning in Archaeology. It seems, various archaeological commentators had said, the theory wars are over, but people aren't having quite the stark headbutting kind of debate that was characteristic when I was, say, in graduate school and shortly after. But the issues haven't gone away. And a lot of what I've been interested in over the years is to try to articulate what are the issues here? What motivates these, what look to me like crisis debates on a kind of cyclical basis? If you look back in anthropological archaeology to the late 19th, early 20th century, as archaeology was being established as a profession, to in the First World War period, on either side of the Second World War, and then in the 60s is the most recent debate where you get, which generated a hyper-relativist reaction to a kind of hyper-scientistic new archaeology set of proposals. And it strikes me that you get that polarization, that polarized debate emerging recurrently in archaeology, in part because of the way epistemic questions are framed. That the presumption seems to be that if you don't have, deductive certainty from rock solid, almost self-warranting data, it's just open season for speculation. So the arguments I've been making consistently is that that's just crazy. You don't have rock solid, self-warranting empirical foundations in any science. And the alternative, that fact doesn't mean you therefore have nothing. There's no way you can make more nuanced or systematic judgments about better and worse knowledge claims, more and less credible data. I think of this increasingly in terms, when Bob Chapman and I were working on evidential reasoning in archaeology, the kind of top line arguments I guess they were conclusions, actually, what I'm going to describe were the conclusions, that setting the bar at deductive certainty is folly. It's too high a bar. And if the bar sort of anxiety about the insecurity of archaeological data and evidence that motivates a radical relativism or skepticism typically arises because of the worry that all archaeological data and evidence are theory laden. So if they're meant to provide an empirical ground for testing theory, the worry is there's a vicious circularity. The theory informs the collection interpretation of the data, and the theory interpreted data are used to test the theory. Well, the central point that I wanted to make for some years now is it's rarely the same theory. So archaeological data and evidence, you require all kinds of warrants of their warranting assumptions, background knowledge, some of which is theoretical, some of which is empirical. But it's not necessarily, or even often, the same background knowledge that would inform the articulation of the hypotheses you want to test. So you can get real empirical leverage when the interpretively constructed data just do not conform to expectation generated by your test hypothesis or your favorite way of theorizing the past. So that's the basic argument for why there is middle ground, and why it seems it's mostly at the level of sort of rhetoric and hyperbole that you get these extreme views. Neither is tenable. Like a data-driven, that the data just speak to you somehow, that some set of data will be foundational and answer all questions, or that because the data are theory-laden, everything is made up any way you want it.
Is coevolution of the social and biological an illustrative example of the integrative approach? For instance, when animal milk was introduced to human consumption in the Neolithic age?
Well, I have to say I don't know enough about the specifics of how coevolution, specifically consuming, a secondary, Neolithic revolution, or the secondary products revolution. I don't know enough about the details of how the evidence was recognized and built and developed for that. But that may well be an excellent example. There's a theoretical shift. There are new resources in the background. I'm not sure where it would be drawn from, but in the background that informs the suggestion that perhaps what's going on is not strictly biologically driven, but also conditioned by like cultural factors that are creating a particular niche or reconstructing resources in ways that change the game in biological terms as well. But the kind of approach it's like an iterative process of establishing, building evidence to, if you have that kind of hypothesis in mind, to figure out how to evaluate it, how to build those models, what kind of archaeological and bioecological data you need to constrain those models and make them credible. So the integrationist account that I'm suggesting is at the level of the construction of the evidence. And the idea is that you could be drawing on, let's say, background bioecological theory, background human physiology, human nutritional, digestive background, to understand, various aspects of a secondary products revolution. I'm not sure I'm answering exactly your question, but my main point is that it's not that the crucial consideration here would be whether the framing of a theoretical account in terms of coevolution, to what degree does that also determine in circular ways what evidence you're going to recognize and how you interpret data. Now, if you have a new framing, you will certainly be looking to different kinds of evidence. But what's crucial is that the way the, say, archaeological or bioecological data are interpreted is not sort of predetermined to come out in favor of your hypothesis. The crucial thing is that you could find out, you manage the evidence, construct the evidence in ways that ensure you could find out that you're wrong. If that makes sense. So even though the empirical foundation is not a given, it's not self-warranting in the case of, well, really data in any context. The process of building, good enough empirical foundations to answer a first set of questions, and then iteratively go back and refine your evidential ground, and as you ask new questions, we draw on a bigger and different range of background knowledge to interpret data. That's the process that I see happening, that I think is progressive in archaeological science when it works well. And I'm drawing here on an account that Hasek Chang, a philosopher of science, physical science, chemistry at Cambridge, has developed, of epistemic iteration. I think that really captures what goes on in archaeology.
Can you give examples of iterative processes in archaeological work that are both theory-laden and data-driven?
Well, one example, actually, well, two. One that I worked up the background for, and the other that Bob Chapman did. The one that I worked on was radiocarbon dating. And so, of course, radiocarbon dating gets used in connection with all kinds of archaeological material, well, and organic archaeological material, and all kinds of tests. It's used to build and assess all kinds of hypotheses and theories. But what I found particularly interesting there was how complex the process has been to move from the moment when, after the Second World War, radiocarbon dating seemed like, because it's grounded in nuclear science, physics, that it just was a silver bullet. It would just give you the answers you needed and displace dependence on all other kinds or any other kinds of chronological system. And through what now get described as 3 radiocarbon revolutions, the first being the initial applications inspired by Libby, but then 50, 60 or more years of ongoing calibration. And now the Bayesian, the arguments for Bayesian archaeologists, that you need to be considering a whole range of background and collateral information to make use of radiocarbon dates. That's an example of this iterative process that, with respect to a kind of evidence, chronological evidence that I've been interested in. And it illustrates for me, not that, radiocarbon dating has feet of clay and it's made up, and it's precisely the rigorous ongoing work on background warrants to determine what gives rise to error, contamination, to, wiggles in the calibration curves now exposed, and so on. It's that ongoing work on the background knowledge to make the radiocarbon dating itself viable, and then all the other lines in combination with all the other lines of evidence to establish culturally, archaeologically relevant chronologies. I think that's a good example of the kind of iterative process that I'm interested in. And then the other, Bob Chapman actually did the background work on this, is the multiple reanalyses of the data from Glastonbury, the Iron Age village of Glastonbury. Classic example of archaeological data recovered by excavation in the late 19th, early 20th century that has had many rounds of reassessment. And in particular, David Clark's famous reassessment in the 70s, which came in for profound criticism. But I think it's a beautiful example, in part because the title of that paper it's a provisional model of an Iron Age settlement. Provisional, emphasis on provisional. An emphasis on his part for making explicit the assumptions that informed the models that he developed of data, of evidence, of building up to models, the famous modular model of the settlement, and then expanding that out regionally. So there's a case where that this is not evidence that could be used for many purposes, like carbon-14 in the context of many different kinds of archaeological research. But this is a very specific site and trajectory of iterative critique and improvement and analysis aimed at understanding as much as possible about the social and subsistence base and context of this Iron Age village. So that's one where, I guess one classic example was where David Clark suggested that you could assume that the distribution, kind of spatial distribution of artifacts reflected like where they were originally, their original disposition, location of disposition, because of a kind of Brownian motion hypothesis. So it's like at 50,000 feet, he's suggesting theoretically that there would be all kinds of different buffeting and affecting, factors. And so things might get stirred around a bit, but they basically stay close to where they were deposited. And of course, the critique of that, this is just one thread in the multiple revisions and reassessments, was that, no, that's way too abstract. You can't, depositional theory needs to be more specific to context. And in the context of wetlands, where you have drying and heaving and getting waterlogged again, artifacts can actually travel a great distance vertically as well as horizontally. So there's a case where he made explicit, a depositional theory that informed the building of his models at all these levels, identifying patterns in distribution and association of artifacts, and then building from there the account, that the modular account of the settlement and so on. But there's a case where, because he made that assumption explicit, and people kind of like, what can you possibly mean by Brownian motion accounting for, that you're just getting a kind of snapshot of exactly where these things were, And so the critics brought to bear better geomorphology, better, a wider range of comparanda, looking at other sites in the region where they could actually track, the dispersal of material. So that's an example that I think might answer more directly your question, because it's the dialectic of data-driven and theory-driven. Clark was a great theorizer, but he anchored his theorizing in close reanalysis of the published data. And when people, got cross with that, they went back and looked at the original data, not just the published data, and they brought in other resources for interpreting those data. In the end, what Bob, who knows that history of research much more in more detail than I do, in the end, the accounts that were later developed are not all that radically different in terms of modular structure, even though virtually every aspect of Clarke's original provisional models came up for criticism.
In Serbia, where there are insufficient funds for scientific research, reviewing old data can yield fresh results.
Yeah, well, one point just about using old data, returning to old data, is that I think not just if you don't have the resources to do new excavation, but the fact is there's such incredible stores of data all over the world, and there has to be a shift, and people have been arguing this for decades. There has to be an almost cultural shift away from preoccupation with getting new data that can be invaluable and important, a big contribution in many contexts, but to working actually with the material that's already out of the ground. That it's just unconscionable to not work with those resources. So there have been arguments going back to the 70s that only if sites are endangered should they be systematically excavated. Maybe in some cases you can make a special claim for why you need to do new excavation. But rather than the culture and the kind of reward system prioritizing, the lead principal investigator dig director who gets the new original data, right, making that the headline news, there should be a rebalancing of what's valued to recognize the creative, innovative insights that can come from reanalysis. So I'm just channeling arguments that people have made for decades, and if you're in a position where you have to do more of that work because the cost of excavation is exponential, that's good. I mean, not good that you don't have resources, but good that the priority is kind of set there.
In your opinion, is the evidence constructed from an excavation done under an outdated paradigm incommensurable with contemporary archaeological questions?
So, the Kuhnian paradigm, revolution account, incommensurability. There's lots of philosophical and history of philosophy or history of science debate about Kuhn's account of that the history of science moves through these massive revolutions where you are literally, he would sometimes say, living in a different world after a scientific revolution than those before, and debate about what he means or could reasonably be understood to mean by incommensurability. I mean, literally, it just means no common measure. And he does identify lots of important ways in which when you shift a conceptual frame for inquiry, you understand your domain in different terms ontologically, you will recognize data to be relevant that hadn't been looked at or you will reinterpret data as evidence in new ways. So there are disjunctions, to be sure, when you get large-scale theoretical shifts. But I think in general, it's fair to say that the radical revolution transformation model with strict incommensurability just does not make sense of lots of development within the history of science, physics, astronomy, biology, geology, not just archaeology. That researchers are much more capable of living in more than one world, of translating, of being, I like the language from some science studies scholars, Collins and Evans, of being interactional experts, where they get what's going on in lines of inquiry research traditions that are not their own. And I think that's to understand how communication can happen across very different approaches to understanding the past. That's at least as important, maybe more important at this point, than assuming that you're living in a tightly bound paradigm that makes it possible for you to understand in only one way. Right? So this science studies, sociologist of science language of interactional expertise, I think is really useful. And it's relevant not only for understanding, capturing how researchers communicate across different research traditions within a field, but also understanding how this trading zone, Bob and I were using this language of trading zones. Archaeology really depends on and is productive and intellectually vibrant precisely because archaeologists are such great interactional experts, so willing and able to learn enough about a whole range of other fields, like, what was necessary to make good use of radiocarbon dating, but all kinds of other fields. That requires interactional expertise where you keep in focus what your goals and questions are, what your data come to, and see but know enough about these collateral fields to see the possibilities for drawing background knowledge or warrants or linking principles from those fields to bring them to bear. So that's not exactly Kuhnian incommensurability, but it means navigating disunity of science, so to speak, across fields in productive ways. And so if there's any way to, encourage that kind of fluency and translation or interactional expertise in archaeology, I think that's crucial. And it's going to be especially crucial for making use of old evidence. So using old evidence requires the translational ability, interactional expertise, learning enough historically about what those original excavators were doing. So you grasp what it was they were collecting and what they were throwing away, and what, you have some context, what their theoretical motivations, political motivations were, so that you have a frame in terms of which to understand the data that you're going to make new use of. And then be thinking interactionally in this other trading zone sense where you're bringing to bear a whole range of resources they didn't have to extract new data from the samples and material that they did gather.
Can you explain the concept of trading zones?
Well, first of all, the concept of trading zone I'm drawing initially from Peter Galison, who's a philosopher of physics. Of late 19th, 20th century physics. And he was, one place where he developed the concept of trading zone was to make sense of physicists and engineers who were thrown together in the Second World War and made to work together, developing radar, for example. They spoke different languages. I don't know, he doesn't say this exactly, but I have the impression they pretty much despised each other. I mean, they weren't interacting. There was no reason from within their fields they would, necessarily engage. And to make a complex, fascinating story, to simplify in ways that Peter might not appreciate, the upshot of his analysis of that episode was that both physics and engineering was different after the Second World War, but especially the physics, the high-end theoretical physics, because they learned lots of things from the engineers, methodologically, technically, conceptually. So he uses this concept of trading zone, and is specifically in reaction to or critical response to Kuhn. He was intrigued that you didn't seem to get the kind of Kuhnian pattern of incommensurability, or where strictly speaking, no common measure, therefore no communication, therefore you live in different worlds. But that where you did get disjunctions, it was often not in a sequence of revolutions within a field, but in near neighboring fields or within a field between different research programs. So there's a beautiful paper that he contributed to a collection of essays on trading zones and interactional expertise, in which he explains how he drew on anthropology, specifically anthropological linguistics, to try to make sense of the kind of communication that did build up when these very different research communities of researchers were forced, in a sense, to work together. So that's where I'm drawing the concept from. And I don't, they have, Collins, Evans, and Gorman are the editors of this interactional expertise and trading zone book collection of essays. And they have a whole built out sort of grid of different kinds of trading zones, ones that are coerced, ones that are kind of organically developed, ones that what kind of power differences are involved, whether they develop a common language and basically become a new discipline of their own, There are only going to be trading zones, they say, when there's still enough difference that you need translation and interactional expertise to navigate. Aspects of their framework I don't totally buy, but if I were to, do the work to really answer your question, I would go back and look at their grid, layout of different kinds of trading zones. And I think what you'd find is not so much that archaeology had a non-trading zone era and then got into being a trading zone, but that archaeologists in different fields and periods and working on different kinds of problems were to varying degrees willing to or forced to engage with other fields. In some cases, after the Second World War, archaeology was one of the poster children, so to speak. Carbon-14 dating was a poster child for peaceful conversion of nuclear science to, non-wartime to peaceful application. And so there was a degree of support and push. Like Libby was actually reached out, was interested in having museums provide organic material from archaeological contexts to test out and demonstrate the use of the technique that he was proposing. So there's a case, not that this was exactly imposed on archaeologists, but the technology kind of came to them. In other cases, I think archaeologists actively reach out for resources that are going to be useful to answer particular questions. I'm not quite sure how to think about, ADNA these days. It seems like got a bunch of big, wealthy, not a bunch, a few big, wealthy labs that have the very specialized technical ability to do ADNA well. And they're trundling along in their own path, appropriating, material they can run their ADNA work on. And it seems to me that the interaction with, that's a kind of appropriative trading zone. There's a great deal to be learned from ADNA, but I think it's regrettable that there's not more attentive engagement, with archaeologists and archaeologists, who really know the context, know what the samples, that are being tested in ADNA labs, what they represent, what the context is they come from. So that's a case where, the technology again kind of found archaeology, and could produce all kinds of science and nature headlines about, you're just not going to have to do any archaeology. We can tell you exactly who these people are. It's like, wait a minute. The questions you can answer with ADNA are not the only questions that are of interest. And actually, archaeology has a lot to contribute in making sense of the ADNA results, usually on quite small samples.
What are some of the solutions we could apply to address the ambiguity of archaeological evidence, problems of underdetermination, and selection biases?
Do I have an answer? No, not really. But I actually, your guest in Adrian Curry in the next episode or the next interview that you're recording, he's done a beautiful job in Rock, Bone, and Ruin of responding to those who are kind of in principle pessimists or skeptics about the kind of evidence that historical scientists, including archaeologists, depend upon. And I think he has a broader frame. He sometimes uses archaeological examples. More often he's using deep time geology and paleontology kinds of examples, evolutionary biology. So he's putting the kind of analysis I've been interested in a broader frame. And I think he's right that you get pessimism, a kind of principled pessimism about the underdetermination. I'm picking up on that particular term in your question. Underdetermination of anything we might want to know about the past by the surviving traces. And the arguments he makes are that historical scientists are not dependent only on sort of isolated traces and whatever ancestral relations, causal dependence they can trace back to an originating context or event. That in fact, there are many other tools in the toolbox of archaeological scientists. And I disagree with him in some respects. I mean, he makes a very strong case that trace-centric theorists, I'm probably a card-carrying trace-centric theorist on his account, have not attended to a whole range of other evidence streams and historical. And the ones that he identifies, like analogical sources, modeling and simulation, performance data generated by models and simulation, I actually think some of those resources do figure in the accounts that some of us who focus on evidence, on trace-based reasoning attend to. But that's a separate debate. He can fill you in on his views about that. But the main point he makes is that that historical scientists are, well, it's a point that has been central for me. Historical scientists rely on many lines of evidence that require, so you have data that have many different dimensions or come in different forms, and you rely on different kinds of background knowledge to interpret them. So just with dating, radiocarbon dating, maybe ceramic seriation, maybe other forms of geological or stratigraphic sequence, and lots of resources. And it's the fact that you have multiple lines of evidence they are not all dependent on the same background theory for interpretation as evidence, interpretation of data as evidence, so that they're not necessarily going to converge because they're all interpreted using the same background framing. Those are cases where you can find out you're wrong. And a lot of the radiocarbon calibration was driven by persistent inability to reconcile well-established archaeologically grounded chronologies with radiocarbon chronologies. The assumption that radiocarbon should take precedence across the board was pretty sharply contested. In some cases it should, in some cases not. But the process of working between multiple lines of evidence, that's, I think, one of the best ways when you're thinking just in terms of trace-based inference back to antecedent events and conditions. That's a crucial way in which archaeological data and evidence have a robustness that is missed when you think of it in terms, Adrian Curry's terms, like a kind of trace atomism. You think in terms of an isolated trace, one long causal chain leading back to the original event, and then all the emphasis is on whether you can get that causal connection, that ancestral, you can reconstruct that ancestral relation. And that's clearly not, even for trace-centered inference, that's not all archaeologists are relying on. So underdetermination, yes, it's a problem for archaeologists, but I would say it's more a pragmatic problem than the kind of, philosophically generalizable worry that says you can't do anything. Does that answer your question? Yeah. I feel like I said some of what I've already said about how evidence works. And analogical reasoning, I understand the building of these cables of evidence to depend upon analogical reasoning. The interpretation of data as evidence depends on analogical reasoning. And analogical reasoning is not just a matter of projecting onto the past what you know and are familiar with in the present. So again, one objection: analogical reasoning just is paints you into a corner. You only see what you're familiar with. Not at all. Sophisticated accounts of analogy, that's a fallacy. Another point that Adrian makes is that historical scientists depend on dependency relations, or they exploit dependency relations between aspects of past events or conditions. So that's where the model building simulation analysis comes in, that you may do some trace-based reasoning to figure out, to get a fix on what it is you want to understand. That there were sauropods is his example. But then you're going to be relying on a whole lot of, and some trace-based reasoning to understand what their, what the ecological context was in which there had to be enough food for them to get as big as they got, right? And then you're depending on an understanding of causal dependencies between various aspects of that past. Dinosaur metabolism, you don't know that directly, but you can infer some of what was necessary for them to survive and be in the form they were in, given causal dependencies with other factors that you can reconstruct in their environment. So those are all strategies that archaeologists use as a matter of course. And attending to those strategies, I think, should give confidence that while you can never establish a conclusion with absolute certainty, it's never going to, that any conclusion is going to be open to reassessment. You can make very nuanced and increasingly constraining judgments about what claims about the past are credible.
What are the main ethical challenges facing archaeology today in an era of post-truth, anti-scientific thinking, and the rise of authoritarianism?
There are a great many different challenges, I would say, facing. There are different types of ethical issue and challenge that practicing archaeologists have to navigate. The ones I've been thinking about most currently have to do with archaeologists' accountability to descendant communities, especially indigenous communities. Since I'm in Vancouver, which is traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation, and so crucially unceded territory. And they, all of UBC is on their territory. Musqueam has long engagement, not always happy, with archaeologists who have excavated their settlement sites and massive settlement sites in this region. UBC hosts a repository where a lot of that material is stored. UBC now has had for some time an agreement, a formal agreement with Musqueam. It covers a whole range of relationships between that First Nation and the university. But increasingly, archaeologists, and over recent decades, archaeologists at UBC have really been in the forefront with many others in working directly in partnership with Indigenous communities. So Musqueam, because we're on their territory, but also others in the region. And so that's an ethical challenge that was articulated at least in the 90s, although there are, even in American antiquity, for example, there are calls going back to the 70s that were not heeded from archaeologists who were saying, listen up, colleagues, we need to take seriously the fact that Indigenous Native American peoples whose ancestors we are excavating and investigating are alive and maybe not as well as they'd like to be, but they're here to challenge and make claims to their heritage. So that I'm thinking of a couple of short pieces that appeared in the mid 70s. And then, of course, in the US, NAGPRA forced archaeologists by federal legislation to have to negotiate, to have to take seriously Indigenous claims, specifically with respect to grave and sacred sites and sacred material, sacred belongings. So I think figuring out exactly how to do archaeology in a respectful, conscientious way, primarily, I would say, in partnership with descendant or communities. These are the cases that I'm thinking about. That is a crucial challenge. And there's not going to be one answer to how to do that across the board. Different communities have had different experience with archaeologists. They have different priorities. Archaeology is often not a priority. So that's not a very, it's not an answer that gives a great deal of comfort. I think archaeologists are feeling their way. There will be contexts in which you cannot do archaeology because of the stakeholder descendant community interests. They should, in some contexts, I would say, supersede archaeological interests. So on the flip side of that, there are, authoritarian, new right, fascist, nationalist movements that are claiming archaeological, that make claims that are unsustainable in archaeological terms. That's not the challenge I'm dealing with so much, but this, respect the voices of other stakeholders who have an interest in the past. You then have to think about, well, where do you draw the line and say, well, I'm sorry, but you just do not get to make claims about the, Aryan ancestry that, justifies your claim to, right? And so there's, depending on the context and what the debate is, I think archaeology has a huge amount to contribute. archaeologists do, precisely this capacity for archaeological data to really decisively challenge certain kinds of claims. I think it's really important for archaeologists to use those tools to take on claims that you might otherwise not even want to bother with, just like ignore and get on with your work. But I think it's really crucial because of the material, tangible nature of archaeological data. It's often possible to get some traction in debate or in negotiation or conversation that more abstract arguments don't get. So so we're in a period where that tension, like on the one hand, maybe 15 or 20 years ago, it seemed obvious, like archaeologists need to take seriously voices and interests that have been marginalized. Well, there are some voices and interests that you probably have to take seriously, but not in the same way as when you're working with an indigenous community.
Why is the philosophy of archaeology important for archaeological education?
Goodness, I have not really thought that through. I have to say, whenever I've been in a context, and the first place was at University of Washington, where I've been able to teach courses on archaeological ethics or philosophical issues in archaeology, or a kind of philosophical histories of archaeology. I found that students, undergrad and graduate students, are really engaged. So they're just, from the ground up, from the student perspective, my sense is there are a lot of students of archaeology who love archaeology. They're passionate about archaeology, and they're really committed to learning the technical details and the skills and the sort of data rich and region or problem specific theoretical resources they need to do good archaeological work. But they're very much alive to the kinds of issues that I address. They're very much interested in what the assumptions are that lie behind. And often these are historically specific assumptions that inform research in a particular tradition. They're really interested in the ethics issues that they expect they're going to have to navigate, that they're going to have to deal with. So I think that's a good reason. I mean, meeting students where they are, I think for all of us, we get sort of steeped in the barrel, trained, working in a field. If you're fortunate and you can stay in the field of your choice, and you come to take a lot of things for granted. That students earlier in their training career, earlier in their careers, don't necessarily take for granted and are really eager to talk about. So I think that's, yeah. The other reason why I think history and philosophy of archaeology is really important is, again, I'm drawing here on Hasek Chang. He has a really lovely account of what he calls complementary history and philosophy of science, in which he argues that historians and philosophers of science have a lot to contribute by kind of reaching back and building narratives, well-grounded narratives about how a particular field or a research tradition has developed. There will often be paths not taken. Like things, maybe it's the funding situation or the politics or just like good fortune, lots of excellent data, very fruitful line of inquiry opens up, and other lines of inquiry get marginalized. Other ways of thinking about a given subject matter get marginalized. And he suggests, like, often you see, he's here in this book working, this book was on inventing temperature. It was on chemistry, the development of fixed points in temperature scales. And he identifies these points where crucial knowledge just kind of got left aside because it wasn't relevant to the the cutting edge, what was the growing edge of the field at the time. And that's worth bringing forward. With archaeology, what I see as particularly valuable is that almost every really productive, generative, critical archaeology that's taken shape, feminist, critical race, class-based critique of nationalism, all kinds of critical archaeology, almost always draw on and are informed by some retelling of the history of the field. where the idea is to recapture, like, why is it that we conceptualize whatever the subject matter is in terms that leave out gender or other range of kinds of social differentiation, that leave that out, or that presuppose Victorian cultural evolutionary theory, for example. Pick your area. And it's through that kind of, again, well-grounded, not speculative, but well-grounded critical history, that paths that could be taken, not ones that were taken and then marginalized, but could be taken, are identified. And that's extremely important for archaeology. I think having good critical history as a part of students' training keeps them alert to possibilities, paths not taken, paths that were taken and were lost, that they could build on in developing their own research programs.
We, from the Sciences of the Origin project, would like to express our many thanks to Alison for her interview. Talking about archaeology as a dynamic science under non-ideal circumstances is of critical importance. For more on the work of Alison Wylie, please check the link below in the description. To all of you out there who are interested and would like to know more about the project Sciences of the Origin, make sure to follow us on Twitter, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our webpage listed below.